All right, get ready to dive deep, everyone, because today we are going to explore the fascinating world of genetics and congenital pathologies.
It's a pretty complex world, but we are going to unpack some cutting-edge research today and learn how our genes can impact our health.
From dwarfism to cystic fibrosis, even some pretty surprising connections. Like, did you know that sickle cell trait can actually protect against malaria?
Yeah, it's amazing how much we've learned about genetics recently, and
Yeah.
it's changing how we understand these conditions.
Before we jump in, though, I think it'd be good to do like a super quick genetics 101 refresher.
Definitely.
Like, just to level set for everyone listening. Genes, right? They are like the instruction manuals for our bodies, determining our traits. We've got alleles, which are different versions of genes,
Right.
and we inherit one allele from each parent. Now, these alleles can be dominant or recessive.
Yeah, like think of it like a recipe
Yeah.
where you have like one ingredient that can like completely change the flavor while another one needs to be doubled to really make a difference.
Perfect analogy. Yeah.
So like with eye color, brown eyes are dominant.
Right.
So if you inherit one allele for brown eyes and one for blue eyes, you'll probably have brown eyes.
Right.
But to get blue eyes, you need two copies of that blue eye allele.
Yep.
Makes sense. Now, you mentioned genotypes and phenotypes earlier. Can you break this down for us a little bit more?
Yeah, for sure. So your genotype is like your unique combo of alleles.
Okay.
It's like your genetic blueprint.
Oh, okay.
And then your phenotype is what you actually see, like the physical expression of those genes, like your eye color, your height. It's like the finished product.
Oh, okay. So the genotype is like the behind-the-scenes code,
Right.
and the phenotype is what we see on the outside.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay. So what happens when there are like, I don't know, typos or errors in these genetic instructions? You mentioned mutations.
Ah, yes, mutations. So mutations are basically like changes in the DNA sequence.
Okay. They can be as small as like a single letter change.
Right.
And these changes can actually lead to genetic disorders.
Mm.
Think about it like changing a letter in the word cat to hat. You have
Huh.
a totally different word,
Yeah.
totally different meaning. Sometimes these changes can be like deletions, where like part of that DNA sequence is just missing.
Oh, wow.
Duplications, where a section is like repeated, inversions, where a segment's just flipped, insertions, where like new genetic material is added.
Wow.
Or even like translocations, where parts of like different chromosomes swap places.
So these genetic glitches can cause a lot of different things,
Right.
from minor changes to like serious health problems.
Exactly.
And we can group these issues as single gene disorders, chromosomal disorders, and multifactorial disorders. Let's start with single gene disorders for now. So how are these inherited? What are the different ways that can happen?
Well, good question. There are several patterns of inheritance.
Okay.
So first, we got autosomal dominant disorders.
Oh,
That means you only need one copy of that mutated gene to have the condition.
got it.
And it doesn't really matter if you're male or female, it's equal opportunity.
Okay.
So achondroplasia, that's a form of dwarfism, is an example of an autosomal dominant disorder.
Okay, so if one parent has that dominant gene, there is a chance that their child will inherit it.
Exactly, a higher chance.
Got it.
Okay, and then we've got autosomal recessive disorders. So this time, you need two copies of that mutated gene
Okay.
to have the condition. And again, gender doesn't play a role.
Doesn't matter.
A good example of that is cystic fibrosis.
Okay, so even if both parents are carriers, meaning they each have one copy of that recessive gene, their child could still inherit the condition?
Yes, there's a 25% chance in that case.
Got it. Okay.
And last but not least, we have X-linked recessive disorders,
Okay.
which are carried on, you guessed it, the X chromosome.
The X chromosome.
Now, since males only have one X chromosome, they are much more likely to be affected by these conditions. And a classic example of this is Duchenne muscular dystrophy.
So it sounds like X-linked disorders can get pretty tricky when it comes to inheritance. Now, I'm interested to learn more about these specific conditions. Let's start with the chondroplasia,
Sure.
that form of dwarfism we talked about earlier. What exactly causes it?
So achondroplasia, which is the most common type of disproportionate dwarfism, is caused by a mutation in the FGFR3 gene.
Okay.
This gene normally helps to regulate bone growth, specifically like how cartilage turns into bone.
Okay.
But when this gene is mutated, it disrupts that whole process and leads to shorter bones, particularly in the arms and legs.
So people with achondroplasia have shorter limbs, but are there any other characteristics we see with this condition?
Yeah, so they often have a larger head with a prominent forehead,
Okay.
and their fingers might be shorter and more spread out, almost like a trident shape.
Okay.
There can also be some skeletal differences like bowed legs or knock knees.
I'm thinking of like actors like Peter Dinklage or Jason Acuna. They both have achondroplasia.
Yeah, they're great examples.
And it's inspiring to see, them being so successful while facing these challenges.
Absolutely. And, it's important to remember that intelligence is not affected by achondroplasia.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Now, you mentioned disproportionate dwarfism. How is that different from other types of dwarfism?
Yeah, so in disproportionate dwarfism, like achondroplasia, the limbs are shorter, like in proportion to the torso.
Okay.
But in proportionate dwarfism, like pituitary dwarfism, which is caused by growth hormone deficiency, all the body parts are proportionally smaller.
Okay.
It's like comparing a miniature version of something to just scaling something down.
Got it. So like a scale model almost.
Yeah, exactly.
Fascinating. Okay. What about primordial dwarfism? I've heard of that, but I don't really understand it.
So primordial dwarfism is even rarer.
Okay.
And these individuals are actually smaller than average from like even before birth.
Wow. Okay.
It's often caused by genetic mutations, but sometimes the cause is actually unknown. Yeah. A good example is Hasbulla Magomedov, the social media star. He has primordial dwarfism.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow. So many different forms of dwarfism. All right, let's move on to polycystic kidney disease, or PKD. What are the key things that we see with this condition?
Okay, so PKD is characterized by the growth of these fluid-filled cysts in the kidneys.
Okay.
So imagine your kidneys, but they kind of look like a bunch of grapes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
These cysts can actually cause a whole bunch of problems like high blood pressure, pain, and frequent kidney infections.
So those cysts are basically interrupting the kidney's normal function.
Exactly. And it's important to note that there are two main types of PKD.
Okay.
There's autosomal dominant PKD,
Okay.
which typically starts showing up in adulthood.
Okay.
And then there's autosomal recessive PKD, which can manifest like right after birth or in childhood.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And to make matters even more complicated, PKD can also increase the risk of other health problems, like brain aneurysms, heart valve issues, and even diverticulosis.
Wow. So this one's pretty serious. Okay, let's move on to another condition that can affect multiple organs, cystic fibrosis.
Right.
So what causes cystic fibrosis?
Cystic fibrosis is caused by a mutation in the CFTR gene,
Okay.
which is found on chromosome 7.
Okay.
This gene is responsible for producing a protein that regulates the movement of chloride ions, which are essential for maintaining that right balance of salt and water in the body.
So one single gene mutation messes up that balance. But how does that lead to the problems that we see in people with CF, particularly their lungs?
Yeah, so in CF, the defective protein disrupts the transport of those chloride ions,
Okay.
leading to this thick, sticky mucus building up in a lot of the organs,
Hmm.
especially the lungs and pancreas.
Okay.
It's like imagine trying to breathe through a straw, but it's constantly clogging up.
Oh, that sounds awful.
It is.
Yeah.
And this mucus buildup is what makes it so hard to breathe
Right.
and causes those recurring lung infections we hear about.
Right. Right.
The thick mucus just clogs the airways, making it really hard for people with CF to breathe.
Okay.
And it creates a perfect breeding ground for bacteria, leading to those frequent lung infections.
Right. Right.
And over time, this can actually cause inflammation, damage to the lung tissue, and eventually respiratory failure.
So it sounds like a challenging condition to manage.
It is. It's actually the most common cause of death for people with cystic fibrosis.
Yeah.
And it's not just the lungs. It affects other organs too.
Right.
Like in the pancreas, that thick mucus can block the ducts that release digestive enzymes, leading to problems with digestion and nutrient absorption.
It's amazing how one faulty gene can cause so many problems in the body.
Right.
Is there anything that can be done to help people with cystic fibrosis?
Well, while there's no cure yet, treatments have come a long way.
Okay.
Medications can help thin the mucus and fight off those infections.
Okay.
And therapies like chest physiotherapy can help clear the airways.
Okay.
Lung transplants are an option in like severe cases.
Right. That's good. Okay. Let's talk about sickle cell anemia. I'd like to understand a bit more about like the genetic basis and how it actually impacts the body.
Okay, so sickle cell anemia is caused by a mutation in the gene that makes hemoglobin,
Okay.
which is that protein in red blood cells that carries oxygen throughout the body.
Right.
So in sickle cell anemia, this mutation causes the hemoglobin to form these stiff fibers when it releases oxygen.
Okay.
and it distorts the shape of the red blood cells, making them look like sickles.
So they're not round and flexible anymore. They're sickle-shaped
Right.
and rigid. So how does that affect their function?
Well, these sickle-shaped cells are much less efficient at carrying oxygen,
Okay.
and they're prone to getting stuck in those small blood vessels, blocking blood flow.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. This blockage can cause intense pain, known as a sickle cell crisis,
Right.
and damage to organs like the kidneys, heart, and lungs.
That sounds really painful and debilitating. I've also heard that having sickle cell trait can actually be beneficial. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, that's actually one of the most interesting parts of sickle cell.
Yeah.
People who inherit one copy of the sickle cell gene and one copy of the normal hemoglobin gene have what's called sickle cell trait.
Okay.
So they don't usually have the symptoms of sickle cell disease,
Okay.
but their red blood cells are actually slightly less hospitable to the malaria parasite.
Really?
Yeah, which gives them a survival advantage in areas where malaria is common.
So it's kind of like a trade-off. The sickle cell mutation can lead to some pretty serious health problems, but in some environments, it can also protect you against a really deadly disease.
Exactly.
Interesting.
It just highlights the complex relationship between genes and the environment.
Yeah.
It really does.
Okay, let's talk about Duchenne muscular dystrophy, another condition that mainly affects boys. What's the genetic cause of this muscle wasting disease?
So Duchenne muscular dystrophy, or DMD, is caused by a mutation in the dystrophin gene,
Okay.
which is located on the X chromosome. This gene provides instructions for making dystrophin, which is a protein that acts like a shock absorber for muscle fibers, protecting them from damage during contraction and relaxation.
So without this protein, muscles are more likely to be injured and deteriorate.
Right.
But why does this primarily affect boys?
That's because boys only have one X chromosome,
Right,
whereas girls have two.
right.
So if a boy inherits that mutated gene on his X chromosome, he'll develop DMD.
Okay.
Girls, on the other hand, have a backup X chromosome. So even if one carries the mutation, the other can often compensate
Yeah.
and prevent the disease.
It's like having a spare tire for your genes.
Exactly.
Okay, so what are the first signs of DMD and how does the disease progress?
So usually the initial symptoms appear between like 3 and 5 years old.
Okay.
Boys with DMD might have difficulty running, jumping, climbing stairs.
Okay.
They might fall more often, have trouble getting up from the floor.
Right.
And as the disease progresses, the muscle weakness just intensifies, affecting the arms, legs, and eventually the heart and lungs. It can lead to the inability to walk,
Oh, wow.
requiring a wheelchair.
Okay. So that sounds really tough. Are there ways to diagnose and manage DMD?
Definitely. So blood tests can reveal elevated levels of creatine kinase, which is a muscle enzyme that leaks out of damaged muscle cells.
Okay.
A muscle biopsy, where a small sample of muscle tissue is examined, can confirm the absence or reduction of dystrophin protein.
Okay.
And genetic testing can pinpoint those mutations in the dystrophin gene.
Okay. What about treatment? Is there any way to stop or reverse that muscle damage?
Unfortunately, there's no cure for DMD yet,
Okay.
but treatments like physical therapy, corticosteroids, and assistive devices can help manage the symptoms, maintain some muscle function, and improve quality of life.
Okay.
The good news is research is going strong, and scientists are exploring gene therapies and other innovative approaches that hold a lot of promise for the future.
It's pretty incredible how much our understanding of genetics has opened up these new avenues for treatments and hopefully cures one day. Now let's talk about chromosomal disorders. Starting with maybe the most well-known Down syndrome, what causes this condition?
Down syndrome is caused by having an extra copy of chromosome 21,
Okay.
hence the term trisomy 21.
Right.
It's like having an extra page in that instruction manual, and this extra genetic material disrupts the normal development process.
So that extra chromosome leads to those characteristic physical features and developmental differences.
Precisely. Individuals with Down syndrome often have these distinctive facial features, like a flattened face, upward slanting eyes, a single deep crease across the palm of the hand.
Right.
They may also have developmental delays, intellectual disabilities, and a higher risk of certain health problems.
Okay. Are there ways to test for Down syndrome during pregnancy?
Yeah, there are both screening and diagnostic tests available. Amniocentesis and chorionic villus sampling, CVS, are diagnostic tests that can detect chromosomal abnormalities with really high accuracy.
Okay.
And there are also these non-invasive prenatal screening tests that analyze fetal DNA in the mother's blood.
So less invasive, just a blood test.
Sure.
Okay. I've heard that the risk of having a baby with Down syndrome increases with maternal age. Is that true?
Well, there's definitely some truth to that. While any woman can have a baby with Down syndrome, the risk does go up as a woman gets older.
Okay.
For example, the risk is about 1 in 385 for a woman who's 35.
Okay.
But by age 40, it increases to about 1 in 106.
Okay. So age is a factor, but it's not the only factor.
Right.
Now, you mentioned that people with Down syndrome are at a higher risk of certain health problems. What are some of those concerns?
So people with Down syndrome have an increased risk of congenital heart defects,
Okay.
leukemia, and dementia.
Okay.
But with early interventions and appropriate medical care, many individuals with Down syndrome can live long and fulfilling lives.
Okay. Let's go into another chromosomal disorder that affects males, Klinefelter syndrome. Can you tell us about that condition?
So Klinefelter syndrome is a condition where males have an extra X chromosome,
Okay.
resulting in an XXY configuration
Okay.
instead of the typical XY. This extra X chromosome mainly impacts hormone levels.
Okay.
Males with Klinefelter syndrome often have lower levels of testosterone.
So how does that difference in hormones impact their development and health?
It can lead to a range of physical and developmental differences.
Okay.
They might be taller than average, have less body and facial hair,
Okay.
and may even develop breasts, which is a condition called gynecomastia.
Okay.
They may also have weaker muscles and bones, experience learning difficulties, and have problems with fertility due to low sperm count.
That sounds like a lot to deal with. Are there any treatments to help with those challenges?
Yeah, thankfully there are. Testosterone replacement therapy can help with those hormonal imbalances and improve physical development. Speech therapy and educational support can also be beneficial for addressing learning challenges.
So early intervention is really key here.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about Turner syndrome,
Okay.
a chromosomal disorder that affects females. What's the cause of this one?
Turner syndrome occurs when females are missing all or part of one of their X chromosomes.
Okay.
So instead of the usual XX pairing, they might have just one X chromosome or a partially missing one.
Okay.
This can lead to a variety of physical and developmental characteristics.
So how does that missing or incomplete chromosome affect their development?
Females with Turner syndrome are often shorter than average,
Okay.
and they may not go through puberty normally.
Okay.
They might have underdeveloped ovaries, which could lead to infertility and increased risk of ovarian cancer.
Okay.
And there are also some characteristic physical features, like a webbed neck,
Okay.
a low hairline at the back of the neck, a broad chest with widely spaced nipples.
Are there any other health issues associated with Turner syndrome?
Yeah, there can be. Females with Turner syndrome may also have heart defects, kidney problems, and learning disabilities. They may experience some spatial and mathematical reasoning difficulties as well.
That's a lot to deal with. Are there any treatments for girls and women with Turner syndrome?
Yes, there are. Growth hormone therapy can help increase their height,
Okay.
and estrogen replacement therapy can help promote the development of secondary sex characteristics and help reduce the risk of osteoporosis, which is weakening of the bones. So, early intervention and ongoing medical care are essential for managing the various aspects of Turner syndrome.
It sounds like Turner syndrome can be pretty challenging, but with the right medical care, individuals can live healthy and fulfilling lives.
Right.
Okay, let's talk about one more condition for this section, tetralogy of Fallot. What exactly is this?
So tetralogy of Fallot is a congenital heart defect.
Okay.
It involves 4 specific abnormalities in the heart structure.
Okay.
These abnormalities basically obstruct blood flow to the lungs, which causes oxygen-poor blood to circulate throughout the body.
So it directly affects the heart's ability to pump oxygen-rich blood.
Right.
What are some signs and symptoms of tetralogy of Fallot?
So babies with tetralogy of Fallot often have a bluish tint to their skin,
Okay.
which is called cyanosis,
Right.
because of that lack of oxygen in their blood.
Right.
They might also have difficulty feeding, fail to thrive, and experience shortness of breath.
And this is why it's often called blue baby syndrome.
Exactly. And unfortunately, these babies are also at increased risk for sudden death if it's not treated.
So that's very serious. Is there any way to treat it?
Yes. Surgery is typically required to correct the heart's structural defects.
Okay.
And with timely intervention, most infants with tetralogy of Fallot can go on to live healthy lives.
That's good to hear. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into genetics and congenital pathologies.
We've only just begun. There are so many more fascinating connections and insights to explore. It really is amazing to think we've only just scratched the surface of understanding the connection between genes and the environment.
It really makes you realize just how complex the human body is. And speaking of connections, are there any, like, links between all these seemingly diverse conditions we've been talking about?
Yeah, there are a lot of interesting connections.
Right.
Like, remember how we talked about achondroplasia and Marfan syndrome?
Yeah.
Both of those actually involve connective tissue abnormalities.
That's interesting. So even though they manifest in very different ways, there's that shared element at the tissue level. What are the implications of that connection?
Well, researchers are looking into whether some of the treatments or management strategies for one condition could actually benefit the other.
Oh, interesting.
It's like finding this common thread
Right.
that could lead to new therapeutic avenues.
That's pretty cool. It's amazing how seemingly unrelated conditions can have these like underlying connections. That makes me think about another link we discussed, the protective effect of sickle cell trait against malaria. Can you talk a bit more about the significance of that connection, particularly from an evolutionary standpoint?
Absolutely. Sickle cell trait is a classic example of how genetic variations can be both beneficial and detrimental depending on the environment.
Okay.
So in areas where malaria is really common, having sickle cell trait actually increases survival rates because it reduces the severity of malaria infection.
So it's like a double-edged sword. The sickle cell mutation can lead to serious health problems, but it also provides a survival advantage in certain environments.
Exactly. It's a really powerful example of how natural selection works.
Right.
In regions with high malaria rates, individuals with sickle cell trait are more likely to survive and reproduce,
Right.
passing on that gene to future generations.
So it's like a built-in defense mechanism almost.
Yeah, you could say that.
It's a reminder that our genes are constantly interacting with our environment,
Yeah,
shaping our health and survival. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive,
we have.
exploring a wide range of genetic disorders and congenital pathologies. What would you say are the key takeaways for our listener?
I think it's important to remember that genetic disorders are incredibly diverse,
Right.
ranging from single gene mutations to chromosomal abnormalities. We've seen how these disorders can impact individuals in many different ways, affecting physical development, organ function, cognitive abilities.
And we've also seen how inheritance patterns determine the likelihood of passing on these traits or conditions. It's fascinating how those patterns play out.
Understanding these patterns is crucial for genetic counseling and family planning,
Right.
helping individuals make informed decisions about their health and the health of their future children.
It's incredible to think about how much we've learned about genetics and how this knowledge is shaping the future of healthcare. As our understanding of genetics continues to evolve, what are some of the key things we should keep in mind, especially when it comes to genetic testing and therapies?
That's a great question. As we gain a deeper understanding of our genes and develop new tools to manipulate them, we need to be mindful of the potential implications.
Right.
For instance, widespread genetic testing raises concerns about privacy and the potential for discrimination based on genetic information.
Yeah, it's like opening Pandora's box. We need to make sure we use this information responsibly and ethically.
Exactly. We need to ensure that genetic testing is used appropriately
Right.
and that individuals understand the implications of their results.
Right.
And when it comes to gene therapies, we need to carefully consider the potential risks and benefits,
Right.
making sure these powerful tools are used safely and ethically.
It seems like with every breakthrough, we face new challenges and ethical considerations.
That's the nature of scientific advancement. It's a constant process of discovery and responsibility, pushing the boundaries of knowledge while grappling with the implications.
Well, I think our listener is now equipped with a solid understanding of the world of genetics and the impact it has on our lives.
I hope so. It's been a pleasure exploring this complex and evolving field with you and our listener.
It really makes you appreciate the complexity and resilience of the human body. There's still so much we don't know, but the progress we've made in understanding our genes is remarkable.
And it makes you wonder, what does the future hold? What new discoveries await us in the world of genetics? And how will they shape our understanding of ourselves and the future of healthcare?
It is exciting to think about the possibilities. Maybe we'll be having another deep dive into all of this a few years down the road.
I would love that. There's always more to learn, and I'm sure the future of genetics holds many more surprises.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? Like all our genetic code just determines so much about us.
And we're really just starting to figure it all out, you know? It's like we've got this ancient scroll filled with secrets.
Yeah.
And every new discovery just gets us a little closer to understanding it.
And it feels like with each new discovery, we're just faced with even more new questions.
That's true.
What do you think are some of the most, pressing questions in genetics today?
Hmm. I'd say one of the biggest challenges is translating all this knowledge into something that actually benefits human health.
Right.
We know about all these genes linked to diseases,
Right.
but figuring out how to use that knowledge to develop effective treatments, that's tough.
Yeah, it's like we have the map, but we don't know the best route.
Exactly.
And of course, there are always those ethical questions surrounding genetic testing and therapies.
Oh, for
How
sure.
do we make sure these tools are used responsibly?
Right.
How do we protect people from discrimination based on their genes?
Huge questions.
Yeah, big, big questions. It does feel like every time there's some big scientific advancement, it's like we're entering this totally new territory.
It's true.
Not just with the possibilities, but also the ethical dilemmas.
Yeah, that's the nature of scientific progress, I think. It's always a balance of discovery and responsibility.
So, thinking about everything we've talked about in this deep dive, the intricacies of genetics, all the different disorders, the connections between our genes and the environment, what do you think, as our understanding of genetics keeps growing, how is that going to shape healthcare,
Mhm.
society, and even our understanding of just being human?
That's a question that's going to keep us busy for a long, long time.
Yeah,
I think the more we learn, the more we realize just how connected we all are, not just to each other, but to every living thing.
that's a powerful thought.
It really is.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of our deep dive today.
It
You've
does.
explored so much about genetics and congenital
We
pathologies,
have.
and I really hope our listeners have a better understanding of how amazing the human genome is.
It was great being here.
Yeah, thanks for joining me.
It's always a pleasure to talk genetics.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something new today and that you stay curious about the world of genetics. It is, after all, the story of who we are.